For this section of the lecture, we're going to talk about the descendants of the feature net, or more modern versions of the same basic principles. The three variants we'll talk about is a more complex version for recognizing words, and then we will talk about two different varieties that are meant to capture the ability to recognize various objects. The first is referred to as the Mcclellan and Roonel Heart network. It is named after the two people who designed this network. Now, this is just a complicated picture to show you a basic network, and it has feature detectors, which are presented right here. It has letter detectors, which are also going to words. Please don't be concerned that you can't make these words from the letters presented. They're meant to, of course, be far more letters connected to these words. This is just for illustration purposes. Now, there are a couple key differences between this network and the feature nets that we've been talking about. Excuse me. The first is there are two different types of connections in this network. The first are excitatory connections. These are represented in red on this diagram. If you're unable to see the red, they are the arrows or the lines that are arrows or have arrows at the ends of them. An excitatory connection works much like the connections in feature nets. Here, if activation in a node reaches threshold, it passes on its activation to the nodes to which it's connected, and those nodes receive an increase in their activation levels. Thus, one node excites another node. The other kind of connection in this network are inhibitory connections. These are all of the gray lines or the lines that terminate with little circles. These work in the opposite manner. If a node reaches its threshold, fires, and passes on this activation to another node to which it's connected in an inhibitory style, then as its activation has increased, it will decrease the activation of the node to which it's connected. This is something one sees throughout the brain. They are both types of connections that exist, and thus neuronal connections are able to both excite other neurons down the chain as they are able to inhibit other neurons down the chain. And this combination of two different types of connections increases the complexity of what is possible. For example, this type of network, which is also abbreviated as an IAC model, an interactive activation and competition model, does not need bigram detectors to solve the same types of problems that we needed the bigram detectors for in that previous set of examples. Another difference between this type of network and the featured nets that we talked about previously is all of the connections are bidirectional in this network. It means that they influence each other in a reciprocal manner. If one node is excited, passes threshold, and thus excites another unit, that unit, if it passes activation or the threshold, will in turn send activation back. And it could be the case where you have two nodes that just get caught in a loop of just exciting each other over and over and over. This is something actually that is also found in the brain. And they will keep at this until some other units will inhibit their process, bringing them out of this synchrony. You don't quite get the same thing for inhibition. If I'm inhibiting, or as one unit is inhibiting another, that unit will not be able to pass activation on because it's being inhibited, unless of course it's receiving a tremendous amount of activation from somewhere else. This is really the two fundamental differences between the Mcclellan and Roonel Heart network and the feature nets that we talked about before. Even though they seem relatively simple, these differences allow these networks to do some incredibly complex things, which you couldn't do with a simple feature net. Moving into the recognition of objects. The first model we'll consider is something called the recognition by components model, or the RBC model. Now, we're not going to talk about the actual model structures really anymore. It's more just getting a general idea of how these three work. So this is conceptualized or to allow us to understand and think about how we recognize three-dimensional objects. And it works in a very similar principle as the feature nets before. It starts with very basic features, lines and angles and so forth, and those lines and angles are then combined into simpler shapes. And these shapes are referred to as geons, which stands for geometric ions. That is what is presented over here. We have a cubic rectangle type shape, and a flat pyramid shape, and a cylindrical pyramid shape, a cylinder, and a curved cylinder of some kind. It is assumed, or at least theorized, that with as little as 30 to 35 geons, you can actually create any kind of complex three-dimensional shape just by attaching them together in different ways. Now, as it moves forward, you can say that these geons, which are the analog, let's say, of the letter detectors, can be combined into more complex assemblies, which are oftentimes referred to as geon assemblies, and these just are more complex shapes. You can think about these as the bigram detectors. Those assemblies are then combined into a complete object, which is then recognized. An example of this is presented here, where you can see these different household objects are actually just combinations of different shapes that have been changed in size or orientation. Here I have a cylinder with a pyramidy cylinder piece on top to give me a lamp. Here I have two different cylinders with a little rectangle to give me a flashlight, a cylinder with the loop-de-loop thing to give me a cup. Here's a telephone, which is made up of a whole bunch of them, a bucket, and a briefcase. And in this way, just as we've been talking about from features on to complex things, as we were able to understand how we could create and build and recognize words, so too does the RBC model present that we generate and recognize objects in our environment in this same manner. Now, this model is said to be viewpoint independent. What this means is it is not reliant on any particular direction from which you are viewing an object, because no matter where you look at it from, you will always start with features which will be combined into geons, which will be slowly then upwardly assembled until the finished object, regardless of where you look at it from, because there will always be features and geons that you can see from wherever you are that you're looking at this object. Of course, you could say that if you can't see the object, you couldn't do that, but then I would say that you can't really recognize something you can't see, especially when we're talking about objects that are being visually recognized. Looking at the second of the visual models, this is called recognition via multiple views. And the logic here is a little bit different than the previous models, even though it ultimately also works in that similar fashion of basic features being used to construct an ultimate object. But now, the difference is, instead of there just being one complete object, like a lamp object or a corn word, here you actually have several, and these represent what you can refer to as reference images. And this idea is that you have several representations of a particular object that allow you to then compare what you are seeing to these reference images that are all of something in different orientations. So for example, imagine cat was the object you were trying to recognize. So you see a cat sitting somewhere. Now your reference images will include a set of images about a cat. A cat standing, a cat sitting, a cat lying down, a cat looking away from you, a cat looking towards you. These are the different, let's say, reference images that you have. And so you will look at an object and see it as it's from features to object, and then you will compare it to some existing reference image. Of course, in this case, you're not going through geons. It's just features to an object, which is then compared, and that comparison is what allows you to recognize that object. Now, they say that you don't need more than half a dozen of these reference images. This is just the current theory, at least. Now, when an object does not directly match what your reference images are, we have to rotate our imagery in a mental fashion. You can't actually rotate what you see. Well, sometimes yes, but a lot of times no. You can mentally rotate it, however, and you will do this until it matches one of those reference images. at which point you will have recognition and know what it is. So this view, unlike the previous one, is viewpoint dependent. It matters what orientation you are looking at this object from, as this will change your ability to recognize it. This then also predicts or implies that there will be certain orientations in which you will be able to recognize an object more quickly, as opposed to other orientations, because of an extended amount of time needed for mentally rotating until you achieve a desired equivalence with the reference image. And some of that is actually borne out in scientific data, which we'll talk about a little bit more in just a second. So there is a growing body of neural evidence, so evidence relating to the brain itself, that supports the recognition via multiple views argument. And much of this is found in the inferiotemporal cortex, the lower portions of the temporal cortex, and this is thought to be where the what pathway ultimately goes from the visual cortex itself. And here we find neurons that are said to be view-tuned. What this means is that these neurons seem to only respond to specific stimuli, like let's say a cat or a pencil, and they also fire at different rates based on the orientation of that specific object, meaning that if the cat is standing, you'll have some view-tuned neurons that will fire very actively, and they will still fire for a cat sitting down, but not at the same high rate as they would for the cat standing up. And this gives us at least some mechanisms that seem to exist in the brain that follow with this notion of recognition detectors that are tuned to specific orientations of certain objects in the world. This is where the idea of a Jennifer Aniston cell comes from, in case you haven't heard that. You can see a diagram in the book that shows activation of neural patterns. And so they found a cluster of neurons that seem to only fire for Jennifer Aniston. They were doing this with single cell recordings in an open brain patient or an open brain surgery patient. And of all the things they showed this person, the only things that elicited firing in this neuron, or that cluster of neurons, was Jennifer Aniston's face. Now the weirdest thing is, it would fire at different rates for different images of Jennifer Aniston. She's looking at the camera, if she's looking away from the camera, short hair, long hair, so on and so forth. And so, even though it's not said that a single neuron does any type of significant processing on its own, it did seem like there was a neuron, or a small cluster of them, that was tuned just to see Jennifer Aniston. Of course, this person must know who Jennifer is, not like in person, but has probably seen Friends or something, and therefore is familiar with Jennifer Aniston. It probably wouldn't happen if you don't know who Jennifer Aniston is. Nonetheless, that of course led to all types of controversy that we won't really talk about here, but it is some evidence to show that it does seem like our recognition of visual objects, not to objectify Jennifer Aniston, but this applies to everything else, and it just became this catch label of using Jennifer Aniston, that it does seem like certain regions of our brain are particularly focused on recognizing objects in specific orientations. So does that mean the recognition via multiple views is correct and the recognition by components is not? Well, not quite, because there's also literature that supports the other side. In fact, there are even studies that show evidence for both things at the same time. Excuse me. So here we're looking at an fMRI's data of activation in different regions of the brain, specifically the fusiform area, which is oftentimes implicated in the recognition of complex stimuli, and we'll talk about it some more in the next part of this lecture when we talk about faces. Here's the left fusiform area, so in the left hemisphere, and then the equivalent in the right hemisphere, the right fusiform. Now, this is showing different degrees of activation when you are seeing a novel object, that is the orange bars. You have higher activation in this fusiform area when you see a novel object in the right side compared to the left side, even though this is not quite 100% relevant to the two views. What matters is this next portion. Now, when I see this object presented to me again, so this is after I've learned it now, and here I'm seeing whatever this object is again. A picture of a cat, of scissors, a hard drive, a speaker, a pen, ice cream cone, doesn't really matter. I see it, I have roughly equal activation in both fusiform areas. When I show the same object again, but in a different orientation, something weird happens. The left fusiform area doesn't take any more activation. It doesn't seem to register really that it's different, but it recognized it, but there's no extra information required, or activation, or energy expended, which we would expect if you had to rotate this image, because you're doing increased cognitive processing. We do see that, however, in the right fusiform area, where now the same object, when it's repeated but in a different view, elicited a higher bold response, which is just your brain in that area is using more oxygen, as we talked about previously with FMRI, neuroimaging technology. So here we can see that at the same time, it seems like your brain, in what is technically the same area on either side of the hemisphere, is operating according to both of the models that we talked about at the same time, which is pretty wild if you think about it. But then the truth with many things of the brain seems to be that at the end of the day, multiple systems are always running, right? Just think back to when we talked about depth perception. There were so many different mechanisms through which we are able to establish depth. So it makes sense that at least the possibility exists that we would have multiple systems for being able to recognize objects. This debate is still strongly ongoing, and much further research is required.